Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in a few days we're about to break for Christmas. Christmas is a time for family, sleeping in, barbecues, trips to the beach and spending time with our mates and families. Our Christmas holiday has its roots firmly in the Jewish and Christian traditions. It's based on a pretty amazing story about the birth of Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, as many Christians believe. The story of the incarnation of God in a baby born in a stable is remarkable even to me, an atheist, because it's a story about the distant God of heavens coming down to live amongst us on earth. It's a story about that God decreeing that tyranny on earth and utopia in the afterlife is not acceptable, and that freedom and equality must characterise life here on earth as well as the afterlife in heaven. It's the story about the birth of new hope. The Christmas story tells us that a saviour of humanity came not as some great warrior or prince, but wrapped instead in swaddling cloth, a baby born amongst farm animals and in absolute poverty. But the story doesn't end there. After his death, the new hope that sprang from the stable in Bethlehem started to gather steam. Religious and political elites were threatened by the wild growth of a new religious sect committed to living out here on earth the values of their God once worshipped from afar. The early Christians shared their resources and lived with greater equality amongst themselves than had earlier been known. They believed that the world here on earth could be a better place for ordinary people. 2,000 years later, the story of the brief life of Jesus Christ still resonates. That's why Christmas is such an enduring part of our culture. Christmas was the start of some very unlikely trouble and the start of new hope. I'm not a Christian, but what I admire about the Christmas story is that it speaks to values that I share, including some that make me a little uneasy when speaking from this place of privilege and power. I identify with the Christianity that teaches love and compassion towards each other, especially the most vulnerable, the widows, the orphan, the sick, those in prison. Those values inspired some of the world's first hospitals, orphanages, universities, and reforms to the way that we treat those who have broken the law. I also identify with the Christianity that demands we live with truth and justice between one another. Those values challenged the status quo on slavery in Great Britain and moved Martin Luther King to march for equal rights for African Americans. And here in our home, it was through applying those same values that Michael Joseph Savage turned the state on its head in an attempt to provide cradle-to-grave security from poverty and despair. In fact, the very first act of the new Savage government was to grant a special Christmas bonus payment to the unemployed. Now there was a true moment of Christmas in the New Zealand Parliament that gave birth to new hope that our political economy could be bent to protect the vulnerable. That was applied Christianity. Why is this government giving taxpayer-funded Christmas bonuses to the obscenely wealthy and not the poor? Is that not an agenda turned on its head? Is that not the Christian values turned on their head? Christ didn't accept that gross inequality is inevitable, and neither should we. Isn't it time we turned the money tables over in the temple once again? Our current political and business worldview has become so focused on endless growth that it has to conveniently ignore the increasing social and environmental collateral damage that comes from mindless growth without values.